Hannity, Boomtown. Now, when the balance of power shifts in Washington, no matter who controls the House, the Senate, or even the White House, well, it's good for business. Now, those who are getting rich in the Imperial City, they don't really care who's in charge as long as the money keeps flowing in.
Washington, D.C. is America's boomtown, and like any boomtown, it needs to have its own aristocracy. In Washington, D.C., we think of politics in terms of red and blue, Democrat and Republican, but here, the color that really matters is green. We think about political parties and you think about political affiliations, but what really matters in Washington, D.C. is power affiliation. And by power affiliation, you're talking about access to political power and access to public officials. And that comes through lobbying.
Whatever law, whatever bill is trying to be passed, it may adversely impact an industry. There's a legislative team for the association and their industry they represent. Fortunately for chauffeur transportation, there's no parking on the Hill. So we're able to provide chauffeur transportation to make sure that they can get to the Hill in a timely manner to sell their vision. There were 100 new House members at one time in the 2010 cycle. And what that means is that every association has to come back to make sure that everything's cool, right? We're okay, you still supporting my bill, thank you for your support, and they get off the Hill. So it's really been great for us in that respect.
Lobbying takes place right here on K Street. This is the epicenter of all of it. It's in full view of the White House and with the U.S. Capitol not far away. And when it comes to spending money, large amounts of money are spent here to influence decision makers. It's a distinctly bipartisan activity. In fact, that's the best way to do it. So you have, for example, a Republican like former Senator Trent Lott, who partners with a Democrat, former Senator John Breaux. The political debates that we see oftentimes are a little bit like professional wrestling. It's not always what it appears to be. And let it not be said that in Washington, D.C., that they don't believe in family values, because to become part of this aristocracy, oftentimes the best way to do it is either to marry into it or to be born into it. And it's remarkable how many members of Congress have family members who are registered lobbyists. So consider, for example, Congressman Bill Young from Florida, who's been in office since 1971. He's the head of a very powerful subcommittee that controls spending on defense. He has a daughter-in-law who's a registered lobbyist. Since 2000, she has lobbied on one issue and done so very successfully. It's, as you would probably guess, on defense spending. Or consider the case of Senator Harry Reid, the majority leader, Democrat from Nevada. He actually has several family members who have been registered lobbyists. He has a son who has lobbied on behalf of several groups and secured $50 million in earmarks. He also has another son who's involved in a $5 billion venture involving a Chinese effort to develop an energy project in the desert of Nevada. In that particular case, the majority leader took a personal interest and helped to push it through. So just remember, when you see the professional wrestling in Washington, D.C., it's not so much red and blue, it's really green, the color that really matters.
And we continue now with Peter Schweitzer and Steve Bannon. By the way, didn't Obama say that he was going to ban lobbyists from his administration? I think he said that, eliminate earmarks. I didn't make those things up, did I?
The most transparent administration in history.
Well, here are the numbers. It's what? You have 78 members of Congress, 27 senators, 51 House members that like Bill Young.
Yeah.
I mean, Bill Young has a, what is it, a sister-in-law?
Daughter-in-law, yes.
Yeah.
That's exactly right.
He's the father-in-law, and he sits on this powerful committee, and she lobbies him?
Yeah, and, you know, here's the parallel universe that's Washington, D.C., Sean. You go to every one of these members, and they will say, well, the fact that my son or daughter or spouse is doing this...
Has nothing to do with it.
I would not let that influence any decision I make. You know, give me a break. I mean, that is just simply not an acceptable answer, and we know how the real world works, and this would not be tolerated in corporations and other areas when you deal with nepotism issues.
You know, you see, it's interesting because there's such indignation and such outrage when something like Enron, or they can demonize Halliburton, but yet this is the worst I've ever seen.
And it was never envisioned by the founders. And this is what we're talking about, a permanent political class. These guys come to Washington a lot of times as country lawyers, and what they do is they stay. Their wives become lobbyists, their children, their in-laws. They build up they've turned the business of government into a family business. And this is how they stay here permanently. This is how it gets to be a permanent political class.
So basically kicking it back to their own, even in this case, family members or friends or people they know or people that hire them when they retire, which happens a lot.
That's exactly right. I mean, if you look, for example, at the Republicans that came in 1994 with the Gingrich Revolution, 10 years later, of those who had left, half of them were registered lobbyists.
Is that because they're not capable of doing anything else? I mean, is this all they're capable of doing?
Well, it may be all they're capable of doing, or it's probably the most lucrative thing that they could do. And the reality is that it becomes very seductive in Washington, D.C., and they accept it because everybody else is doing it.
Yeah.
And that's really the sad reality. So it's a massive cultural problem in Washington.
But you talk about an aristocracy, a political class that exists here. So for all intent and purposes, you're dealing with people that are living up off the public dole, taxpayers connected in some way, shape, matter, or form, and are never called out on it.
Worse than taxpayers. It's $2.2 trillion of tax revenues. They have the arrogance to borrow the rest, continue to borrow it, not worry at all about shrinking government or cutting budgets, while their entire families are benefiting from that. That's what we talk about the permanent political class. That's why we look at incentives. You ever work on Wall Street, you always look at where are the incentives? Where are the incentives in the equity?
Follow the money, Steve.
Follow the money, exactly. And here, if you follow it, you see why there's no incentive to cut budget, there's no incentive to really shrink the federal government, because this permanent political class of both political parties is benefiting.
Real quick, did you find people in your investigation that actually do the right thing? People that have higher standards, or?
There are a few. There are a few that are there.
There are a few.
Yeah, but
really, you're instilling confidence.
There are a few, Sean, and the reality is it's very hard for those individuals to rise in seniority in either party, because the horse trading and the benefiting of family members that takes place is really what helps you gain in seniority and climb in leadership.
It's systemic. It's systemic.
It is. It's the culture.
It's systemic.
That's why it's the Boomtown. That's why they're living high on the hog and the rest of the country's suffering.
Yes, sir.
All right, we got to take a break. We'll come back a lot more on our special. And coming up, imagine spending, well, $100,000 a day just to try and influence the U.S. government. Well, that is the amount that one company spent in 2010, and it paid off for them big time. We'll tell you that story next. And welcome back to the special edition of Hannity. Now, today, to succeed in business, it takes more than a good product, good marketing. It also takes a dedication to feeding the beast that is America's new Boomtown.
When most of us visit Washington, D.C., we arrive this way. We fly commercial. But there are lots of visitors to Washington, D.C. who don't come on commercial jets. They come on private corporate jets. Because in Washington, D.C., America's new Boomtown, private corporate jet business is booming. There's an airport not too far from here out west that literally has 70,000 private corporate jets that take off and land every year. And that's not even to mention Dulles Airport, another airport nearby that has a new jet center to house corporate jets. It was oversubscribed and sold out almost immediately when it opens. Why do they come? They come here because this is where the money is. Washington, D.C. is a town that has a business, and that business is government. It gives them the opportunity to spread around all sorts of cash, and that cash obviously is what corporations are looking for. 40 years ago, American corporations didn't have much use for government bureaucrats. You see, only about 14% of the largest companies in the United States would put an ex-politician or an ex-bureaucrat on their corporate board. Today, that's changed dramatically. Now it's 50% that have ex-politicians or ex-bureaucrats on their corporate boards. And why do they do that? Because they feel like they have to have the relationships and the contacts with the powers that be in Washington in order to effectively stay in business. Lobbyists spend a lot of money in this town. Consider the single case of General Electric. That single company spends $100,000 every single day, 365 days a year, to influence and lobby Congress. And who do they pay? They tend to pay the people that voted previously for bills that related to General Electric. So individuals like former Congressman Gephardt from Missouri or former Senator Trent Lott from Mississippi, who've been paid lobbyists in the past for General Electric. And how profitable is it to lobby? The sad reality, it's oftentimes the best investment that a corporation can make. In fact, it can be a lot more profitable than buying or creating a new service or a new good. There was a study done a couple of years ago by two professors at the University of Kansas. You know what they found? They found that for every dollar that lobbyists spent on a particular bill in 2004, those companies returned $220 for their investment. That amounts to a 22,000% return on investment. Where else can you make that kind of profit in America today?
22,000% return on investment.
Yeah.
That's pretty amazing. 30 major corporations now spend more money on lobbyists than they pay in federal taxes. They didn't pay a dime, right?
That's exactly right. And there's a relationship there. You know, General Electric did a lot of lobbying. They got government money for green energy. They got tax credits, but they spend a lot of their time carving out things in the tax code that benefit specifically them. Now, look, Sean, I'm not somebody who wants people to pay really high taxes, but the reality is when you have a system in a situation that leads corporations to feed the beast so that they can actually make more money on the side, in other words, pay their tithe or make their offering to Washington, D.C.
I'll be honest. I mean, how can they be competitive if they don't? If their competitors are doing it,
exactly.
It's Washington that I blame for allowing it to happen.
Absolutely. They set the rules. That's exactly right, Sean.
This segment is the one that the audience ought to focus on of how you get into state capitalism. That graph that shows the 2,200% return. If you have after-tax return on Wall Street now of 20%, you're a rock star as far as the company goes. It shows you that big government has now made it that an investment in further big government, right, and further regulation helps these companies. Also, look at the corporate boards. I mean, this is the way big government infects capitalism. Now that you have to have a bureaucrat or a former politician on your board, and the reason companies put them on there, because they need somebody to help them navigate
And they pay them a lot. Let's be honest.
Absolutely, yes.
Do you know what they usually pay them?
No, but these corporate boards, you get stock options, you get stipends, you get pay. I mean, they're very lucrative. That's why people do it. You also have liability, too, but it's very lucrative. But the reason companies do it, they need people to guide them through Washington.
And by the way, you mentioned the 70,000 jets that are landing there. I doubt they're going to the Lincoln Monument. I think, or the Washington Monument. I think they're probably going there.
You're right.
To make deals.
You're right. Exactly.
And they have access.
Yes, that's right, Sean. In fact, you know, an interesting illustration was with President Obama's inauguration. They actually shut down one of the runways at Dulles Airport to make it just for private jets. They had so many private jets coming in. So this is a massive problem. And look, we're not opposed to wealth creation, but when it's wealth creation by extracting it from taxpayers and manipulating in a crony capitalist system, that's a huge problem, and that's what's taking place.
Now, if I'm one of these Americans that we spoke about earlier, my house is underwater, or one of the 6 Americans that are on food stamps, or I'm watching larger portions of my pay go to the federal government and state government, and I'm paying all these taxes, I think I'd start getting a little angry by now.
This is why we want to turn the camera on something that's never been exposed. The people in Washington never want to talk about the lifestyles. They never want to talk about the construction cranes. They don't want to talk about the private jets. The private jet guys that built the private airports out there by Dulles and also at Dulles, they thought it was going to take them several years to sell those slots. They sold out in 72 hours. That is the level of corporations and high rollers.
So they already
have
a lot of money. So if you own a private jet, they're not cheap.
Exactly.
So you got to get in there. What about the dinners, the meals, the lunches? That's still all going on, right?
Absolutely. You know, Washington, D.C. is booming. If you go to the restaurants in Washington, they're going to be crowded. It's hard to get into a lot of the venues. And that's what's so strange about this. I mean, if you go to a lot of major American cities, you know, business is slightly down, or you can get into
D.C.
Not in Washington.
That's right. And the more expensive the restaurant, the better off they're doing.
That's exactly right.
And I guess they're buying these congressmen and senators, would you like a 1964 whatever? I'm not a big wine connoisseur, but that's where they're getting them.
Yes, that's exactly right. And, you know, as we pointed out, while 1 in 6 Americans are struggling in terms of worried about where their next meal is coming from, Washington, D.C. is now the town with the highest rate of consumption of fine wines. So they're not getting wine in a box. This is very expensive, top-flight wine. fine.
I mean, it's not Boone's Farm? All right, we got to take... You ever try it? It's not bad. We'll take a quick break. We'll come back. When we come back, we're going to tell you a problem that Lamborghini dealers in Washington, D.C. are having. It's not one that you might expect. Straight ahead.